My name is Dawn Martella and I'm with Amador Master Gardeners, and today I would like to talk to you about putting your vineyard to bed because a little bit of effort expended in the fall has a huge difference on your next year's growing season. So the vineyard we're in today is planted with a wine grape variety called Dolcetto. This vineyard was planted with leftover vines from a commercial vineyard planting, and it's essentially been treated as bird food and landscaping. So beyond pruning and irrigation and in some infrequent fertilization, it's had minimal care. Pretty much something that you really don't want to do. So learn from my mistakes. First thing I'd like to start out with is when you're looking at your vineyard in the summertime, you really want to make a mental note of how your vines are doing. Looking for things that could be indicative of nutritional issues is important. Paying attention to vigor, watching for mildew, mites, bunch rot, irrigation problems. All those things can have an impact on your vine, not only this year, but for next year's growing season. So in this vineyard, I noticed that there is some nutritional issues starting to develop. You can see some venation patterns in the grapevines and the leaves. Over here especially, I have a big notice of one. I have venation patterns. I have these short little leaves that are starting to show up. They're getting a little funky look. On the vines themselves, I've noticed some unusual fruit development, and because this is used as bird food, the birds have been very good this year. So this is the rachis of a normal cluster, but I've also had these unusual fruit set clusters. And so even though there's no berries on them, you can see with the pedicels that there's a lot of space between the actual berries. Whereas on a normal grape cluster, you're gonna have, a much more tighter closed cluster. So that's telling me that something's going on with this. I've pretty much determined it to be a zinc deficiency, maybe some other nutritional items as well. So noting these can give you a game plan for next year. And if you're not sure, say you're looking at your vines, you're seeing what you think are nutritional issues, but you're not sure, go ahead and have your soil tested. There's a lot of different testing companies available, and that way you're going to get a definite analysis knowing exactly what you need to apply. So what do you do first? Well, immediately after harvest, you want to go ahead and give your grapes a really good drink. They've been working hard all summer long getting your fruit ripe. So giving them a nice deep drink allows the vines to revive somewhat so that they can begin that work on storing carbohydrates. The other thing is, in the fall, pay attention to the weather. Oftentimes we'll get some rain. We'll think that might work for irrigation when actually if you dig down into the soil, you'll find that it has a very shallow penetration. So in this vineyard, I typically will water about every 2 to 3 weeks until the rainy season begins. So you do want to check your irrigation once you start watering to make sure that your vines are getting adequately watered. And let's go ahead and walk over here because I want to show you a great simple way to do so. So coming over here, you want to dig a hole. So you water your vines the amount of time that you think they're needed. The day after, go ahead and about 18 inches or so from the vine, not under an emitter. It can be near one, but not under emitter because that would be cheating. You want to dig about a foot deep hole. And you're looking in the hole, and the purpose of looking in the hole is to make sure that there's moisture all the way down, because that's showing that the water is actually getting down into the root zone. If the hole is only partway dry, you obviously need to increase your time that you're watering. This vineyard on the average I found needs about 12 hours or so, give or take, depending upon temperatures, in order to get that good penetration to the root zone. So one thing I always try to have people remember with watering, especially as you get into the fall, is the duration or the amount of time that you water in order to get that water to the root zone. Once you've established that, that's not going to change. What will change will be the frequency or how often. Like I said, if the temperatures are warmer, maybe every couple weeks. As the temperatures get cooler, but it's still dry, maybe every 3 to 4 weeks. So just keep that in mind. So from the period of September through November, this is a time to watch out for pests in your vineyard. Things like mites, things like powdery mildew can become an issue at this time. So we're going to go ahead and throw a slide up here and let's talk about mites. If you have hot, dusty conditions, if it's dry or the vines are poorly irrigated, these are really good conditions for mites to develop. Now, with the slide here that you're seeing, you're going to see the damage that mites can cause. And their feeding causes a stippling effect on the leaves. It looks almost like they're slightly bleached. The other thing that you'll notice with mites is if you turn the leaf over, or sometimes you'll see it on the bud nodes, you might notice a little bit of webbing that's occurring. And if you actually have a hand lens, you can look on the underside of the leaves and you can actually see the little tiny mites crawling around. A second type of mite, and we'll go ahead and put this slide up now, is called the Grape Uranium Mite. And the Grape Uranium Mites cause blister-like galls on the surface of the leaves. And the Grape Uranium Mite can become a very big problem if it's not addressed, because these will definitely overwinter in your bud scales and the population will flourish the next year. So how do you treat them? It's pretty easy. Neem oil or a horticultural oil is great for treating mites. If you use it, you do want to make sure that the underside of the leaves are thoroughly saturated. You also want to make sure that your wood and your trunks and all that get saturated, because mites can overwinter not only in woody tissue but also in the bud nodes. For the uranium mites, there's actually been some new research done by UC that shows that a wettable sulfur application applied after harvest has shown really good impact at reducing the numbers for the following season. So something to be aware of. The other problem that you really want to pay attention to is what's called powdery mildew. And in the vineyards, we usually see this starting to show up if conditions are right before harvest. So sometimes you'll see it on your grapes. You'll definitely see it on your leaves. And you can see by the slide that it just gives this powdery, dusty appearance. This is a problem if you have a lot of shade, if the temperatures are somewhat cool and damp. And it's important to address powdery mildew because you want to limit any overwintering spores. Now, the treatment for powdery mildew is similar to mites. You can do neem or horticultural oils, although we found that wettable sulfur works really well on getting rid of powdery mildew. Okay, if you are spraying your vines in the vineyard this size, I will probably be using a backpack sprayer. But if you are spraying your vines at home and you just have a few and you want to use just a little hand pump sprayer, it's really important to remember that they have to be saturated. You really need to get a thorough coating on the underside of the leaves as well as the woody tissue. A few considerations I really want to mention when it comes to spraying for both mites and for powdery mildew. So first of all, when you spray your grapes, you never want to spray if temperatures are going to be 90 degrees or above, because you can get some severe leaf scorch on your vines. The second thing is products like your neem and horticultural oils, so that's one type of product, and your wettable sulfur, which is another type of product. Those products should never be mixed, nor should they be sprayed close to one another, because if you do so, you can get severe vine burns and you could even kill your vines if they're young and weak. So if I was to spray using both products, first thing I would do is I would water my vines the day before, because that makes them a little bit more resistant and gives them a little bit boost to get through the spray process. Spray with my neem oil, maybe I'm dealing with mites or what have you. Then I'm going to wait about 2, even 3 weeks if the temperatures are warm. And if I have a powdery mildew situation develop, then I will spray with my wettable sulfur. Personally, for me, I think it's easier if you use just one product. It's definitely a lot safer. Either one is useful on the vines. And the last thing I want to emphasize, and this is something that's really good to get in the habit of, is if you are spraying, you want to make sure that you use proper personal protective equipment, your PPE. So what is PPE? Anytime I spray, I make sure that I have covered shoes, I wear long pants, I have long sleeves on, I have gloves on, I have a face mask on, and I wear eye protection. While some products might be pretty gentle and benign, other products, especially in the case of wettable sulfur, can be very irritating to your skin and definitely irritating to either your eyes or your mucous membranes. So I've just found as a personal rule that if you make it a habit to wear that every time, you're never having to worry about being safe. It's a good idea to do a light fertilization at this time as well. Your main fertilization is going to occur in the spring once you experience that new growth surge. But in the fall, the vines need a little bit extra nutrients to hold them during the dormant season. You will use a slow release fertilizer. You can use a synthetic. You can use an organic. You can use a combination of manure and compost. But you want to do one that's a little bit lower in nitrogen, really emphasizes mostly on the potassium and the potash. And the reason for that is if you have too much nitrogen, you're going to actually stimulate new leaf growth, and that's something that you're trying to avoid. You do need a little bit of nitrogen because you need to stimulate the roots to start uptaking those nutrients. So there's two methods to do so. One is a band dressing, and the other one is a broadcast method. So with the band placement, you want to do it about 2 feet away from the vine. And the reason for that is that's where your feeder roots are located. You go about 2 feet from the vine. You're going to dig a light trench about 2 inches deep. With your fertilizer, you'll follow the application rates that are listed. Good rule of thumb is about 1 pound per 100 feet. And essentially what you're going to do is you're just going to put the fertilizer at that prescribed rate within the trench. Once you've added the fertilizer, you definitely want to cover your fertilizer because that way you avoid any type of nitrogen loss, which is really important. For the broadcast method, you'll go again about 2 feet away or so from the vine, and you want to lightly cultivate an area. If you have a few vines, you can do it in a rectangle around the vines. This is an actual aisle, so I'm probably going to do a whole cultivation in the aisle. You will broadcast it. You can do one of the little broadcasters according, that spreads it. You can do it by hand, what have you. So lightly cultivate your soil to a depth of about 2 inches. You can go ahead then and take your fertilizer, and at about that prescribed rate, go ahead and spread that out. You will want to mix that in, okay? That's really important. The other thing that you can do is you can do a combination of manure and compost, and you want to use an aged manure. And so with your manure, you'll actually spread about 1 inch thick, okay? And if you have one of those little push spreaders, those things are amazing for this. Makes it a lot easier. Then with your manure added or your broadcast fertilizer, you definitely want to mix it into the soil. Again, you want to prevent that nitrogen loss. So you mix it in. I'm doing this quickly for the sake of the video. You might want to take a little bit longer and just get a good mix in there. Okay? Once that's mixed in with the manure, then again, take that spreader and cover that area with your compost. Rake it smooth or what have you. Now, if you were planning on doing a cover crop, this is a great time before you do the final cover to actually plant your seed, because you can put your fertilizer down, add your cover crop seed, mix it in, and then go ahead and cover it with compost. If you were not going to do a cover crop, you can also do a mulch. The compost does act as mulch, but a further mulch on top of that is actually a good idea. We use here in this vineyard, I have a little bit of a rough wood mulch around the vines. That's something that you get from the PG&E trimming crews. That works great, especially if it's slightly aged. You can do leaves, you can do straw. What's important is you lay it out, put a cup at least 2 to 4 inches thick. You want to keep it away from the vines though. So you want to allow at least 6 to 12 inches from the vine when you're laying your mulch out. And the reason for that is it could trap moisture if it was against the vine can cause crown rot issues, and that's something that you want to avoid. But mulch is great in the vineyard. They've done a lot of studies lately. They're finding it's wonderful for moisture retention. It's great at weed suppression, and it really helps it helps prevent a lot of runoff in the vineyard. All right, so if you are considering cover crops, a few words on that. You may want to consider, especially with around grapevines, a seed mixture instead of just a single cover crop such as a fava, clover, or legume. The reason for that is seed mixtures usually provide a much more diverse benefit to your vineyard. They will usually consist of things like grasses, maybe some grains, the legumes, the fava, the clover, and all that. If you've ever driven through our Shenandoah Valley down near Plymouth in the spring, you'll see some of the vineyards will have the cover crops, and they just look so pretty. Another advantage to cover crop is they're wonderful for giving you a really good green manure in the spring. If you've had pest issues in your vineyard, like mites or powdery mildew, once you have leaf drop, it's really important to remove that litter. You don't want to go ahead and leave it here, because then all you're doing is overwintering any inoculum or problems. So if you had the pest issues, rake up your leaf litter. If you have any rotting fruit or mummies left on the vine, dispose of those too. Definitely don't put them in your compost pile. You don't want to trade problems. If your vines are healthy though, leaving the leaves drop is really great to adding organic matter to your soil. So as cold weather approaches, and hopefully the rainy season approaches too, the last thing that you're going to want to do in the vineyard is shut down your irrigation system. One thing that's important to remember though is if it is a dry season, if it is a dry winter, you may periodically need to turn the system on, irrigate your grapes, shut it off, and drain it again. So there might be a little bit more work in that instance. But as a rule, on a normal season, you'll shut off your main valve, which is your feeder. Once that's shut off, so the water here to the vineyard would be shut off completely, I would then take and drain out all of my irrigation lines. Open them up, turn the valve open, allow them to drain out and empty. Once that's done, I do reclose these because it keeps debris and bugs and everything out of the lines. I disconnect my risers, insulate them a little bit more, and then a good way to protect them even further is to just throw a bucket over the top, and that just gives you that one extra layer. You're done once then, and you're good to go. So let's recap, shall we? So remember to note any vine issues in order to create a game plan for next year. You want to water deeply and immediately after harvest, and you want to do it about every 2 to 3, maybe 4 weeks until the onset of the rainy season. That's really important. Address any pest issues such as mites, powdery mildew. You will lightly fertilize, and you can mulch or plant a cover crop at that same time if so desired. If you've had infected debris from pest issues, you want to clean that up, including any rotting fruit. And then as the cold weather approaches, shut down and drain your irrigation system. As you can see, a little extra effort on your behalf this time of year can give your grapes a head start going into dormancy. And that's something that's going to have a great benefit on next year's growing season. So on behalf of UC Master Gardeners of Amador County, I want to thank you for joining us today. Happy gardening.